Great. So hello everyone, I'm Brianna Simmons, and before I give my offering today, I have my own acknowledgement. So if I held a moment of silence for each that died to make this space, this state, and this university possible, I'd never speak this weekend. Perhaps not even until the end of the year. So as I'm learning new templates for love, creation, and collaboratively creating ecosystems from the earth, what I feel is appropriate to offer this morning to the earth and to those sitting in this space and possibly watching it now and in the future. And those names I don't know that I allude to is heartbreak, conviction, and righteous anger. So those are the themes I'll be channeling as I dissect what I'm meditating on in this offering. So today, this is how I'm practicing the with in witnessing and co-producing knowledge. And to my panelists, thank you for reading my draft. Okay, so what I'm offering today is a series of reflections on how I've been taught and chosen to engage anthropological training in learning how to design a dissertation research study and my experiences in ongoing research and applying for funding. Grants now because it's grant season. Okay, so I'm calling this the Plantocratic nature, and it's a tentative formation in what the Plantocratic actually constitutes, and that's something that I'm challenging us to sit with and not necessarily answer, but see what that evokes for you individually and collectively. So this project is something that for me is both nonlinear, that came from a series of intergenerational experiences navigating healthcare in the US and in Trinidad. And after my first year of graduate study, I was invited to participate as a research assistant for an HIV syndemic study in Kenya and collaborating with women who are full-service sex workers in 2 different cities in Kenya. So while I was there for the purpose of our study, which was a multiple state dissemination and qualitative workshop, I learned about the children who live in the hospital, and that was kind of a red flag for me. I'd come into graduate school wanting to understand what are these relationships between why Black women experience the world the way they do wherever we go. It's always the similar sets of stories. And so I wanted to understand that in the context of healthcare, and mothering is a more recent engagement that I've been trying to sit with and embody. So I was walking through the hospitals, trying to understand what did they mean by children who grew up in the hospitals, and it was this function of body detention that I'll explain throughout the remainder of my presentation. And what I saw was bars on the windows of different wards of the hospital, people who were homeless and sex working within the hospital, and different traces of forms of violence. And so traces, evocation, the affective is something that I will also be suggesting we sit with and pay attention to. And so moving into the terms of engagement, as a result of colonialism, Arab, Muslim, and transatlantic chattel slavery, apartheid, imperialism, and other systems of racialized domination, Black people share common experiences of oppression. Our global present is an ongoing interdiction of Black people's comportments and mobilizations of bodily sovereignty, self-determination, and love. Globally, anti-Blackness is systematized through genocide as unfreedom and structures how Black people may experience life. So inaugurated by chattel slavery economies, the modern mode of relation, interconnection, and exchange is globally structured by anti-Blackness. And I'm gesturing here to Bledsoe and Wright, who talk about the anti-Blackness of global capital at different scales. So what I have and continue to engage are what are the scales of change required to end the systemization of Black suffering vis-a-vis anti-human perception? And how are Black positionalities and anti-Blackness vital analytics to answer this question? I'm interested in the anthropologies that Black people have developed around the study of African peoples and African descendants, and for our communities, for our lives. And as I learn more about those who commit to these communities, while I'm here, I'm also concerned with this particular terrain of engagement with respect to academia and the discipline of anthropology, which we may read as the humanities, capital H writ large. I want to understand, how does this impact the way that I can research anti-Black genocide vis-a-vis sexual terror? So what I offer are two definitions for those who are unfamiliar on anti-Blackness and genocide. Scholars who engage Afro-pessimism through an analytic of anti-Blackness argue that civil society as we understand it and live it is informed and formed by the dehumanizing condition of chattel slavery. They claim that civil society, therefore, what we know and do in our current systems, is inherently antithetical to all manifestations of Black social life, yet requires Blackness for its political, economic, ontological, epistemological, and spatial coherence. That's the dimension that I'm seeking to engage, a theme in scales. Alongside them, I discuss and understand anti-Blackness as a recursive, fractalizing thought system which has created the internal worlds and outside worlds that we occupy. Can reference the fractal for a visualization here. So as a conceptual vocabulary distinct from race and racism, anti-Blackness makes a structural argument about the way of thinking encoded through colonizing operations of control, degradation, and exploitation that is now refracted as a modern world and social order. Functioning as a political and ontological framework, this vocabulary emerges from the select treatment of Africans as perceived as innately antagonistic to a racialized understanding of who and what is human. What I mean to say is that this treatment as anti-human, meaning not human, where a vocabulary of race is talking about degrees of humanity, I'm talking about anti-humanity. This is establishing new terms of racialized relation, wherein these people, captive Africans, now Black or blackened as a kind of social process here, simultaneously coordinate what is super, sub, and non-human, meaning plants, air, water, right? So we're talking about the borders of species as a simultaneous hierarchy of human beings is established through a language of race. So adding complexity, Bledsoe and Wright show us that the assumed aspatiality of Blackness establishes the condition for any expression of global capitalism to function. This is an extension of the theorization on spatial coherence of Blackness, which examines the way Black life is negotiated, muted, negated, erased, and distorted, based on an assumption of the lack of Black spatial cartographic capacity to assert itself in our imaginations. Right, so these logics cast Black geographies and people as empty and threatening, open to occupation and surveillance, and this is something that is mapped onto the body, any variation of Black bodies, and we see this particularly with those who are non-gender trans, and seem to have to assert themselves with the conjunction of Black and queer, trans inserts, so on. So as such, aspatiality extends the analytic of anti-Blackness that I'm engaging today. So in lay terms, dynamical systems, like the fractal you see, evolves over time a state space according to a fixed rule. The crude formula that I have at the top is my attempt to notate how the function of catastrophe, capital C, are determined by an input of anti-Blackness, which produces all things weather and wake, a nod here to Christina Sharp. This system is self-correcting and calls itself in the archetype of the human in the genealogy of Sylvia Wynter back into existence by evolving the capacity of the racial matrix, the legible social vocabularies, meaning that anti-Blackness is taking on specific characteristics based on shifts in the social order. It also means that Black people don't have to be present for anti-Blackness to structure a daily way of life, right? So I'm going to skip ahead because I believe I'm running out of time. So the ethnographic study that I'm working on, Mothering Against Genocide, Anti-Blackness, Reproductive Unfreedom, and Black Invention, examines how anti-Blackness, healthcare, motherhood, and mothering are a co-constitutive state project in 21st century Kenya, and focusing on the informal settlement of Mathare constituency. So conducting this collaborative ethnographic study as critical participatory action research, this study examines how conditions of reproductive unfreedom, vis-a-vis sexual terror and body detention, shapes the ways that women can embody motherhood. Body detention is a hospital, morgue, and mental health facility practice where in these facilities imprison people who cannot pay their bill until it is paid. This interest accruing bill can be inherited, is alienable, and practiced in over 30 countries, magnitude unknown. So over 12 months, I'm collaborating with community health workers who service the constituency, gender-based violence educators, and mothers who have been detained to map the social, structural, and spiritual barriers to reproductive freedom, what's producing anti-Blackness. And so my attempt here, which I'll allude to later, is I'm engaging anthropology as a mode of Black study. So as I critique what constitutes the field, what I choose to focus on is the production of anti-Blackness itself, rather than inscribing a field from the position of a university. So we juxtapose this mapping with a co-created vision of reproductive freedom, where we are figuring out how to collectively articulate bodily integrity and build transnational Black relationships. And this is how I engage the method of Black diaspora as method. Taken together, this study explicates how these projects define Mathare constituency as a zone of organized abandonment, as well as how Kenyan women navigate and/or contest these constructions. So as I think about how Black people survived genocide and how we have been for centuries with respect to healthcare and mothering in Nairobi, I'm concerned with the scope of structural limitations and the kinds of questions which can be asked and engaged within disciplines and research. So as I come into the plantocratic nature of the field, I want to reiterate what my research questions are, and these are two photos of Mathare for a visual. Okay. Let me see. I think I've alluded to some takeaways and what I mean to center Black positionalities, so let me get to the meat of it, the plantocratic nature of the field. My inspiration for this reflection came from Savannah Shangai's book, Progressive Dystopia, where she talks about anthropology as a mode of Black study. And she writes, for anthropologists of Black people in the Americas, that field work is never completely out of sight of another set of fields. And so the plantation, like the ships carrying African people as cargo, operationalized and meshed terms of racialized relation via anti-Black perception and the modes of production. So plantation fields, which anchored settler colonial world-building projects within and beyond the United States, were the first chattel slave factories whose geographic structure functions as a technology of domination and subjugation. Here, plantation fields are a requisite for the extraction and consumption and reproduction of sexualized labor through racial sexualized violence, psychological dissonance and dismemberment, and relentlessly being dishonored and hunted. And this is something that I gauge epistemologically with the assumed aspatiality of Black people, our intelligences, the way that we comport and embody love and interconnection. So let me jump through what I mean to do with the plantocratic. Rereading Shangai's emphasis on the field to mean the physical planes, logic, and disciplinary study is conducted in and with, I'm suggesting that disciplines are an iteration and the field is an iteration of the plantation. We might take discipline as an anthropology, capital A, to be a connected metageography by the same logics. And this is an allusion to Catherine McKittrick's genealogy on plantation futures, a Black sense of place, and the ways that it functions to establish an uneven colonial economy. So as these things, plantations called the first prisons, police, city, and organized abandonment, I began to consider that what the field is not identical to plantations, that conscription and bondage have changed, but as the rule of anti-Black antagonism, it evolves. So this is the learning process that I'm trying to examine, is how academy and statecraft are connected. So if disciplines, fields, and universities, which make them possible, are these interconnected attendant geographies to the modern day plantation, how can epistemic rebellion be engaged to produce something that is not in the same vein of another plantocracy? So as I'm trying to engage who is complicit, I acknowledge that I'm not romantic about the fact that I'm beginning this from the university. And as I try to engage this as a mode of stewardship and not business, which is a hint to preliminary fieldwork that my collaborators were reminding me of, I'm also aware that this is servicing myself. So it is the tension that I'm juxtaposing ethically with how can research be a mode of stewardship rather than exploitation, considering that we are trained to obstruct and extract, and how can research be in service of the people that we are learning with and from. So far I've suggested that the ideological form of anthropology and the humanities, and not just, but the humanities, humans, is subtended by anti-Black notions. This has been exported and globalized with various tweaks through our interconnected systems, which are social, symbolic, institutional, spatial, storied, and more. I wish I got to tell you about my funding experiences. They've told me that my work is too applied, and so the ways that I'm trying to negotiate this is possibly by publishing locally, doing this in pieces. I have different methodologies of co-producing knowledge called Fieldworking with the Dead that I'd like to talk about more, which include audiovisual modes of storytelling and energy work. And my last question, which is somewhat joking, as I think about the scales of rebellion, is should I crowdfund my research? And I'm not joking.